All right, because Hank Green is everything. I think that this should give a better understanding about memories, and he'll talk about the brain a little bit. So I think this will help. Here you go.
If you learned to ride a bike as a kid, at some point you probably left the bike in the garage for months or years before coming back to it. And though you might have been a little wobbly when you finally decided to climb back on, you never had to go through the training wheel phase that you'd had at the start. That feeling is so familiar, it's become a figure of speech. When something is easy to remember after a long time not doing it, you say, it's like riding a bike. But this kind of memory really does stand apart from other kinds. Even when people suffer memory loss, memories of how to do things often survive. So why is riding a bike just like riding a bike? Motor memories get stored differently than lots of other memories, making them harder to lose. But like other memories, there's still a lot we don't know. Motor memory is the ability to repeat motions and remember motor skills. It's part of a category of memories called implicit memories, which are generally things you learn less by thinking and more by doing. And when you learn things without putting in specific effort to learn them, weird things can happen. Like back in the 80s, 48 students were asked to identify what was in some incomplete photos. Some they had just seen the full version of, but others were completely new to them. But then, 17 years later, researchers got in touch with 12 of them, brought them back, and compared them to a control group who had never seen any of the pictures before. Those 12 still did better at identifying partial photos when they hadn't seen the full version in 17 years, while the control group didn't show any difference. 4 of those 12 students also said they had no memory of even being in the study, which is part of what makes it implicit. No one ever sat them down to make them study up on photos because they were going to be tested later, like you might for a test in school. Those implicit memories also use different brain systems than other kinds. One of the first on any list of brain parts related to memory is probably the hippocampus, which is involved in making new memories. But it's less important for implicit and motor memories. One reason we know this is from studying patients with amnesia. When people suffer injuries to the hippocampus and nearby parts of the temporal lobe, they tend to lose memories from before the injury, and also can't make new memories afterward. These are called retrograde and anterograde amnesia, respectively. And while it would be, of course, massively unethical to cause brain damage in order to study memory, case studies of people who have suffered brain injuries can give us unique insight. Basically, if someone damages a part of their brain and loses a certain function, you know that part was necessary for that function. And some of these cases have interesting twists. For example, one patient spent years volunteering to shelve books at his library after a motorcycle accident caused him to lose his hippocampus, preventing him from making new memories. But he still learned the Dewey Decimal System, even though he couldn't tell you how he learned it. Which means that researchers have to look beyond the hippocampus to understand how implicit memories work. And for motor memories in particular, we got a few leads. One of these regions is the cerebellum. That's a part of your brain that's separate from the cerebral cortex. Other brain regions involved in memory, like the hippocampus, are part of the cerebral cortex. So the fact that it's separate might be part of why this learning can be unconscious. And one of its major purposes seems to be fine-tuning of motion. That includes careful movements like balancing on a bike or playing the piano. It's a complicated system, but some of the tools that make it all work are called Purkinje cells. They collect signals from neurons coming from other sensory systems like sight and sound and convert them into a signal that fires at a variable frequency, up to 500 spikes per second. That signal gets sent to different motor systems like hand grasping or gait, hopefully adding up to a smooth, fluid motion. One of the mysteries, though, is that this might not be where these memories are stored. Instead, research has pointed to changes in a number of different brain regions, not all of which are where we'd expect. For example, in a study published in Nature in 2004, 24 people were split into 2 groups, one of which was asked to learn how to juggle. After about 3 months of practice, they all could juggle for a solid 60 seconds. The researchers scanned their brains and found changes to the temporal lobe and the intraparietal sulcus in the group who learned to juggle. These weren't regions associated with memory, per se. Instead, they had to do with tracking visual motion and planning hand movements. But then, 3 months after that, the volunteers got their brains scanned again, and those changes were still there, though they were a little smaller. That's even though none of them reported continuing to practice. I guess once the scientists tell you you're done, you just stop juggling. Come on, have some fun. But similar studies found other brain locations were important, so we probably won't ever tie motor memories to just a single location or process. And those neurons in the cerebellum might not be just for motor skills. There's evidence some cognitive tasks require them as well. Some research has even tied them to emotional experiences. So the next time you get back on your bicycle, give some thanks, at least in part, to your cerebellum. It's one of the major things keeping you balanced and upright and contributing to your ability to hold on to that for years. Thanks for watching this episode of SciShow Psych. We couldn't make SciShow without the help of our patrons. Patrons get access to neat perks, not least of which is the satisfaction of helping to bring free educational content to the whole entire internet. If that sounds like your jam, head on over to patreon.com/sci.
All right, class, I'm also going to add in this video, how does our brain store memories? I hope this is helpful. It's the last one here, so it's about 11 minutes of videos. Again, if you need anything, let me know. Hope this is helpful.
Memory is a wide range of phenomena, from simple recognition of a face or a logo or letters that create words, to complex recollection of events that happened exactly how, what order, etc., etc. Memory is amazing. And before we go into it, it's important to know that there is no one single memory structure. There isn't like a hard drive or a central library or anything like that. It's this big, weird biological mess that manages to work better than anybody else's big, weird biological mess in their head. I mean, human memory is pretty amazing. But keep in mind that animals also have something resembling it. It's not necessarily the same thing, but their brains work very similarly. It's important to note that we're only going to talk about human memory, but being it's probably the most complex version of memory on Earth, and it's ours, that's the one that makes sense to talk about. So there's two kinds of memory: short-term memory and long-term memory. Short-term memory is pretty important in order to get anything done at all. Most things are a process, and one needs to know where they are in that process, so at every moment, they need to remember what they're doing and how much of it they've done already. For instance, let's say you're playing a turn-based strategy game on the computer. At every given moment, you have to remember the state of everything that's going on. What did your opponent do during their turn? Where are all of their units? Okay, I've made a decision as to what move I intend to make. Now I have to remember it until I make that move. It's a constant loop that needs to constantly be fulfilled in order for you to have some semblance of idea what the state of everything around you is. If you didn't have short-term memory, you basically wouldn't know anything going on around you. Everything would just be a really weird blur. And it's also possible that you wouldn't have any long-term memories either, on account short-term memory is what's converted into long-term memory. There's an area deep in the brain called the hippocampus, and no, it is not like a college for hippopotamuses, or a university if you're, fancy. No, it's simply an area of the brain called the hippocampus. But now you have a very, very good mnemonic device, right? Yeah, you do. Look at all those hippos going to college. So basically what happens is the short-term memory is, for lack of a better term, played back in the hippocampus. And believe it or not, a long-term memory is kind of an aggregate of a bunch of small, short-term memories. You have a short-term memory of how you felt, of what you saw, of what you ate or touched or smelled. Essentially, a lot of different sensory short-term memories are aggregated into a single long-term memory. Basically, the hippocampus takes this fully formed aggregate memory and creates connections between neurons that are eventually fixed in place. It's important to remember that this is not immediate, that they are fixed in place, and essentially saves it as, for lack of a better word, data. Now, I'm not saying that this is done in some sort of binary arrangement like actual data, because honestly, I don't know. But the way these neuron combinations eventually are fixed essentially acts as an index for the aggregate, and as one recalls that specific memory, the index specifically calls different parts of the brain. If you're observing a brain scan of somebody recalling something, different areas of the brain are clearly active. What's interesting is the way that this memory is stored, the combinations of different neuron connections, is that they can actually be dependent on arrangement of molecules. Memory is actually aggregated on a molecular level. Knowing how small a molecule is, which is unfathomably small, you literally can't understand it by human perception. You need tools to. It's fair to say that there's quite a bit of storage space on your brain hard drive. But as much as that is a strength, it can also be a weakness. Biologically speaking, the material that we store memory in is just like anything else in our bodies. It's organic, it's carbon-based, and it can break down. Being things are being done on a molecular level, any small amount of breakdown could easily corrupt or even eliminate a memory altogether. When one considers the fact that it is operating on such a tiny level, and that the brain is constantly rewriting what is going on, it has to rewire itself on a constant basis on account the human body, the human person, the human being has to constantly adapt to a changing world. Again, this is both a huge strength and a huge weakness. Unfortunately, it makes perception and memory fallible, but it's also what makes personality, the expression of our experience and our interpretation of the world, possible. It is this imperfection that I would say is what makes us human, and it's not all entirely rooted in memory. However, without this type of memory, without this way of doing things, it wouldn't be possible. It's also possible the brain never actually forgets anything. Like I said, memory storage happens on a molecular level. It is tiny in scale. So we don't really exactly know what the phenomena of forgetting something actually is. It could be that the brain drops the data because it deems it no longer important, or it could be that the data has been accessed so many times or rewritten or changed in some way that it can't properly be recalled. The data is corrupted. There's still a lot that we don't understand. However, we do understand the difference between long and short-term memory and how it is interpreted to create long-term memory, which essentially creates reality for us. Perception without memory would just be a non-stop stream of unstored input. And I'll say it again before we stop, memory is amazing. What do you think? Do you have an interesting memory or an interesting thought about memory that you just remembered and want to share? Leave it in the comments for us. Also, if you enjoyed this video or found it useful, please click the
All right, thanks guys. I hope you found this helpful. All right, let me know if you need anything.